through climate services, climate-related insurances, and better management of climate-related risks. So thank you so much for being here today, and really look forward to it.
Thank you so much, Shirley. And Chris and those who arranged all the preparations for this, it's quite a privilege to have this opportunity to share some of the learning and I guess a few opinions that are attached to the learning. So just a little bit of an overview of what I'm going to talk about. As a part of the Climate Services Learning Agenda and the CISRI project, there's some knowledge synthesis activities trying to take stock of what's already known as it informs direction in the future. So I want to talk a little bit about how well have Climate Services been serving African farmers so far. What does the evidence say? What practices do we know that increase the effectiveness of climate services with respect to farmers, livelihoods, farmers' use, and how can those practices be adapted to be made to work at a national scale? And then what are the big logjams? What are the big impediments to improving the effectiveness of climate services for farmers across Africa? What are those big impediments, and what can be done at a kind of a continental scale to remove some of those logjams and enable adoption of good practice climate services? So Julie already mentioned the context, the learning agenda, the CISRI project. But the work that I'm going to present is also informed quite a bit by several USAID-funded projects, particularly the Rwanda Climate Services for Agriculture project and Climate Services for Africa project that's working with regional climate centers. And it also reflects some of the experience of the CCAS program and the IRI in trying to make climate services for agriculture across Africa and other continents. So, what happened? Okay. So, when we talk about climate services, there's a lot of interchange between the use of weather and climate, and when we talk about climate, there's a lot of mixing of climate variability and climate change. In reality, the atmosphere varies at a whole continuum of time scales. In some ways, the distinction is arbitrary, but in some ways it really matters. So all of these time scales are relevant to agricultural decision making at some level. As we think of weather, which is days to weeks ahead, climate variability months to years, and climate change decades or longer. So the information that matters is kind of driven by the decisions. What's the lead time, planning time scale of the decision? What climate impacts? What climate sensitivities relate to the decision? So if we start with decision making, we understand a little bit better what's needed in terms of climate services and how it can have an impact. But as we go from the weather time scale to the climate variability time scale to the climate time scale, a few things happen. The decisions tend to become more context specific, farmer specific, as we go from kind of routine agronomic management, pests, irrigation, to decisions about farmers' scarce capital and land and household resources, and farmer goals become more important. The information also becomes more uncertain, and that makes it also more complex to understand. And there's actually some insights from psychological research about why that's the case. There are two different cognitive processes for dealing with uncertain information and incorporating it into decision making. And as we go from weather, which is experienced day to day, to something that's really a statistical, abstract which is the case for climate, we kind of move into a different, more abstract analytical processing mode that is more complicated, requires more training, and introduces, well, they both introduce different biases. But for these reasons, decision makers need a lot more help to understand and effectively use climate information than weather information. And so climate services have to be a lot more than just adding climate information products to the information that a weather service provides. So one definition that I like from the Climate Services Partnership is it involves the generation, the translation, the communication, and the application of climate knowledge and information for planning and for decision making. And if you think of it this way, you recognize that there's a demand side of climate services and a supply side of climate services, and there are capacity constraints on both sides that need to be addressed. So I'll kind of gloss over fairly quickly one of the knowledge synthesis products, and that's a review of the empirical evidence in the literature on the uptake, the use, the impacts of climate services for farmers. We attempted to find all of the published literature and gray literature we could find that gives quantitative information about these things. So when we looked at access to climate information, it's across countries, within countries, across studies, there's a lot of variability in access rates. But most of that literature doesn't answer. Is it because the information is not accessible, or is it because low demand prevents it from being used? We just don't know very well. But and so if access rates vary a lot, then use rates also vary a lot. But we dug a little bit deeper and looked at to ask the question: can farmers use climate information? Is it useful to them? A smaller set of studies, about 18 of them, I think, give information on access and use rates that allow us to look at what of those farmers who access information, what fraction of them change their decisions based on it. And literature is kind of schizophrenic about this, because there's a lot of sentiment that argues about why farmers cannot use it, but then the data themselves show that in most studies, the majority of farmers who access information act on it. In some cases, a very high percentage for crop-based farmers. For livestock farmers, pastoralists, it's a lower percentage and less consistent. Of course, we're really interested in understanding the economic benefit, the livelihood benefit. Does acting on climate information improve the welfare, however they define it, livelihood, food security, resilience? And we find that there are real gaps in the evidence. The estimates are generally positive, but there's a lot of uncertainty that shows up in inconsistency, but a lot of uncertainty that's just due to the challenges with the methodology, gaps in methodology, well, relative to the complexity of evaluating climate services. So there's a huge need and opportunity to improve the methodology to evaluate climate services. But one really important thing to consider when we look at the evidence is that good practice is advancing more rapidly than the evidence of its added value. And so most of the empirical evidence in the literature, I would argue, is in the context of kind of off-the-shelf information products and services that we have really compelling evidence is poorly designed, poorly tailored to farmers' needs. So there's an important caution when we look at the evidence. If the evidence shows that there's modest benefit of poorly designed climate services, does that imply that climate services are worthless? Or does that imply that good climate services will give better results? Unfortunately, we just don't know enough. The evidence always seems to be 2 steps behind the implementation of good practice, the innovation. So then moving on to another synthesis activity, looking at what we know about good practice through the lens of scalability. I think the fundamental challenge that we have to confront when we want to scale up from a pilot scale where a lot of the learning, the innovation, the successes with farmers has happened to a national scale, we necessarily confront trade-offs. And the more we understand and manage those trade-offs, the more effective we can be. Trade-offs, well, between tailoring and scaling, between responding to diverse context-specific needs versus national institutions being able to provide services equitably to a very large population. And the scaling challenge may look very differently depending on whether you're coming from agriculture like I am or National Meteorological Service. So as an agriculturalist, to me, the question is how can these practices that seem to work well for farmers at a local pilot scale be implemented nationally? But from a national meteorological perspective, when they are facing the challenge of serving a very large population, many sectors, many diverse needs within the sectors, how can they scale down and meet more context-specific needs? But another thing that we have to think about as we go from a pilot to an aggregate, a national scale, is institutional capacity constraints. And I'd say that they're pretty serious on both the supply side, which is primarily the National Meteorological Service, but also the demand side, the many institutions that, well, that are involved in the translation, the communication, and the use of climate services. So I'm going to start to talk about the supply side. So just briefly, the roots of climate services are in Africa are largely the establishment of regional climate outlook forums and mainstreaming seasonal climate forecasts in most national meteorological services, which started continent-wide in a systematic way in 1997, 1998. And the very strong but highly publicized El Nino event also seemed to catalyze a lot of activity in Africa. I think I have to give Australia, groups in Australia, some of the credit about a decade before setting the stage for a systematic approach to agricultural climate services. And that was driven more by the agricultural research community in very close collaboration with the agricultural industry in Australia. And a lot of that work started with looking at historical weather data, and there's a lot of use of modeling to translate raw climate information into crop production decision support, a lot of dialogue with users, and then seasonal forecasts kind of got added to that. But the way that climate services got launched and formalized around the climate outlook forums kind of eclipsed that learning and created, well, I think it, from my perspective, the regional climate outlook forums, which has been one of the main drivers and sustainers of climate services, has also kind of locked it into a mode that's not that useful for local decision making. So there's a persistent usability gap between what we know decision makers need and what's routinely available. And actually, no matter where this question has been asked of farmers, in many places in the world, we come up with the same answers. These forecasts expressed as shifts from the historical tertile probabilities mapped over large areas, but often expressed not as tertiles, but as below normal, normal, or above normal. The forecasts are disconnected, the seasonal climate forecasts are disconnected from the local climate, the climatology. There's no information about the climatology that you're predicting in this kind of packaging. These categories are really difficult to understand, even if you understand them to be tertiles. It's confusing to think of, so what's an increased probability of an above normal probability of a below normal category? And a little bit of psychological research explains why this is so messy, but also the use of above normal and below normal without it being defined and explained, that creates problems. But even worse, often many of the National Meteorological Services when they bring this information to the general public, they use phrases like, the rainfall will be normal to below normal, and that gives you almost no information. But one concern, everybody would like to know with greater certainty what the future is, but given the inherent limitations, the chaotic nature of the atmosphere, there's uncertainty about the uncertainty. Here you don't really know how much you can trust this. It's not very transparent. You're asked to trust the meteorological service instead of the data. And something that comes up pretty much all the time in agriculture is, what about the timing of onset? What about risk of dry spells or extreme heat or other things that are more important for agriculture? Can that be incorporated into the information? Whoops. Sorry about that. There's a lot of discussion about context-specific needs, and that's kind of the key challenge that emerges as we think of trying to scale up climate services and have them still effective for farmers and other local agricultural decision makers. But I would say, as I review the evidence in the literature, information needs are context-specific when it comes to what variable, what climatic hazard is affecting your system, what's the lead time relative to your decision-making, what, the seasonality, where does it fit in the calendar. We also find gender differences and accessibility to particular, I was warned that this is a touch screen. How do I get rid of that? Okay. But the evidence that I see seems to suggest that aspects of packaging, format, scale may be pretty consistent among farmers across cultures, across locations, across socioeconomic groups, even across regions. So if we look at that list of what's wrong, that's the best evidence that we have about what works is pretty good documentation about what's wrong with the current convention. So if we downscale seasonal forecasts, statistically, if we provide a full probability distribution instead of these arbitrary above normal and below normal categories, if we package that information with time series information and with probability distribution of the climate before the forecast, so you're looking at how does a forecast shift a climatological distribution, that seems to address all of the weaknesses that are most frequently identified, and then also adding additional forecast variables like start of the growing season, risk of damaging dry spells, and so forth. So there's some work being done on that. But one of the interesting things about this tercile convention, it made it easy to make maps instead of providing locally relevant information. It also made it easy to get away with not sharing the data, the historical data. But it sort of prevented users from learning how to understand their local climate from the historical data. But that, as you introduce historical information into the seasonal forecast and get rid of this division between the two, it also has a lot of intrinsic value. One of the most basic questions when you think of climate adaptation is, what is the climate that you're adapting to? What is my local, what's the seasonality, what's the variability, what are the trends that define my local climate, and am I currently adapted well to the climate now? There's no point in talking about adapting to climate 20 years from now if you're completely off right now. So introducing, looking backwards at a climate time scale as well as looking forward can give a much richer, more actionable picture. So historical climate includes time series data, but also potentially a range of derived seasonal statistics that are of interest to farmers. And where historical information is used, there is kind of a rich body of practice around coming up with the right derived information that's relevant to agriculture. And that historical information it's really useful to start with a time series because farmers can relate to that, related to their own memory, but then the time series can actually be converted in a very straightforward way to a probability of exceedance, which then puts the historical data and the forecast data in the same terms. And then there's also some work that could be done translating raw climate information into impacts and management options. For a farmer or for an agricultural decision maker, rainfall is not necessarily the most relevant climate variable. Crop production might be a more relevant climate variable, or pest risk, or inflow into the reservoirs, or things of that sort, or even soil moisture. So there's potentially a lot of opportunity to increase the relevance of climate information by going more downstream, translating it into more actionable information. And then we are finding that graphical representation of this information can be used effectively with farmers, regardless of education or literacy level, if it's done in a very systematic, logical group process. I gave a wish list that's pretty daunting for National Meteorological Services, who face a lot of challenges. I won't go into the political, the human resource, the financial challenges, but a couple of technical challenges. There are huge gaps in observing systems in almost all African countries. Most are decreasing in time, and you have a few countries like Rwanda where a social upheaval, this isn't the worst impact, but one of the lasting impacts is they lost 10 years of their historic climate record, and it took them 10 to 15 years to start building it up again. And I just want to say that, when I first started working on climate information, I was really excited about the possibilities of what could work with farmers, but I knew that I faced an impossible problem because it's things that you can do with farmers that live near a meteorological station that's been maintained for several decades. It's impossible to replicate that in locations that don't have the data. And it's impossible for a Met Service to do the sort of manual processing, which they know technically how to do, but to do it not for 2 or 3 locations, but for 1,000 or 10,000 locations serving 10 million farmers. That's it's impossible to do custom analysis. So you have to have a way to deal with the data problem. You have to find a way to deal with the human resource problem with automation. So there's an initiative in ACTS, and when it was first developed in Ethiopia, the E actually stood for Ethiopia. They had to change the definition of the acronym when it started expanding to other countries. But colleagues at the IRI, starting in Ethiopia, developed methods to merge their quality control station data with satellite, and then for temperature reanalysis and digital elevation proxies to create high-resolution historical data sets that are of pretty high quality, no gaps in space or time, and we can go back more than 30 years for precipitation, more than 50 years for temperature at about a 4-kilometer resolution anywhere in the African continent. And because, well, there are a number of groups that do the sort of merging of satellite and station data, but I think this initiative is kind of unique in that it's not developing globally available data sets, but it's done completely in a capacity building mode where the National Meteorological Services develop their own data sets using all of the data that they have access to that are not available outside the country in the public domain. And as a result, we expect the quality of these national products for the 11 countries so far in Africa that have done this to be better than the best global data set that any advanced research institute or private company in the North can provide. And I'm sure that that statement will get have a lot of controversy. It's something that could be tested empirically. This wasn't designed as a test, but we showed that exactly the same seasonal forecasts are dramatically better. Sorry, I have to keep from touching this. They're dramatically better if they use the country's merged data set than if they use some of the best globally available data sets that have less station data incorporated into them. And then these become the foundation of a number of the types of derived products that I talked about that can be developed with station data, but this opens the possibility of developing them at a high-resolution grid for every location, every 4-kilometer pixel within a country, which makes it possible to have locally relevant information products at a scale that's relevant to farm decision-making for an entire country. And because of the, well, these are produced with a software platform developed at Columbia University, but owned and operated by the Met Services. It has the flexibility to do a lot of analyses and visualization. And so the term map rooms shows up in the websites of most of these national meteorological services. If you go to them, the opening view will be a map showing gridded data of some sort, historical or and monetary, or in a few cases forecast. And then if you pick a location, a pixel or an administrative polygon, you can drill down and get additional location-specific information. It's most advanced in Rwanda due to the generous funding of USAID in a climate services development project that, this is my bias, I admit I'm biased, but I feel like it's about a 60%, 40%, maybe 40% of the investment belongs to the Met Service, and 60% of the climate services investment is what happens outside of the Met Service within the agricultural sector. But because this is being connected to demand, we're kind of pushing the boundaries on the types of information products that are developed first historically, but then also introducing the type of downscale seasonal forecasts that I have just talked about. We're also working with other USAID funding with ICPAC, the regional center in East Africa, and Agromet in West Africa to develop subsets of these products to try to embed capacity in the regional centers to build the capacity of national meteorological services. There's a lot that can be done technically. I feel like there are a few things that are standing in the way of this, some of these good practices being taken up by National Meteorological Services. Well, there's a technical, financial, human resource capacity challenges common across all meteorological services, and I don't want to go into that too much, but investment is making some incremental progress there. But the regional climate outlook forums that were designed to bring together climate information producers and users and to sustain and to build capacity around climate services before it was called climate services across Africa, adopted some conventions 21 years ago. They were completely driven by climate scientists that, like I say, were useful for a particular purpose, but they're really dysfunctional when it comes to local decision making. But we have poor practice that's been kind of formalized as good practice or best practice by the regional climate outlook forums. And once things are moving in a particular direction, it's really hard to steer it in a different direction. I've actually been in discussions with a regional climate center director and a National Meteorological Service director. The National Meteorological Service director is having a, he's sort of humoring us in implementing these online high-resolution seasonal forecast products, struggling with, can he sustain it? Is he confident about it? Is he ready to? One of the things that's holding him back, though, is that the Regional Climate Outlook Forum, led by the regional center, doesn't do it that way. They do it the old way, the consensus subjective forecast expressed in a particular way, even though he sees the potential benefit. The director of the regional center, who is hosting the East Africa Regional Climate Outlook Forum, Garkov, is excited about the new products and also thinks that it would be much more useful, it would make the Regional Climate Outlook Forum much more valuable to development and to adaptation across the East Africa region. But he's held back by the National Meteorological Service directors, who are basically his boss, his board of directors, and who are resisting change. So there's a logjam here that somehow needs an external shock to get past to allow what we know to be good practice from a user standpoint to actually be adopted. And, but there's also a problem at the country level where most African countries, probably most developing countries around the world, have sort of follow the European model of not treating data as a public good, but as a source of revenue. This is, I guess, both because of advocacy from Europe and others as they were privatizing their data, and structural reform policies from the donors that pushed government agencies to raise money. And a National Meteorological Service that has limited capacity for services, the easiest thing for them to use as a potential revenue source is historical observational data. But in order to sell data, you have to hoard data, and those that you sell it to, you have to restrict how they can use it. So it never actually becomes useful. It never gets past projects. And we have climate services in Africa that are driven, that have their roots in climate forecasts that are divorced from the climate that it's forecasting. And that is really, really broken. So somehow we're going to have to get past this policy, the business model, and somehow get countries to invest in the data as a public good and provide enough public funds so that the data themselves can be made freely available as a resource for the country's development. Okay, on the demand side, there are a number of organizations, research groups that are much more fragmented than the climate community that are working on the communication, trying to find ways to make the use of climate information more effective to farmers in particular and other local decision makers. And every climate sensitive sector has this climate services community that's coming from the demand side. I mentioned that so climate information is fundamentally different from weather information, and it really needs different processes in order for farmers to understand it. A lot of the work on around climate services for farmers in Africa has come from participatory action research, bringing together farming communities, climate information providers, researchers from, coming from various places, with a lot of dialogue, a lot of co-learning. And that's, in some cases, created the opportunity to improve the, well, pretty consistently, it improves the communication of climate information. In some cases, it actually improves the information, the products that go into it, typically at a pilot scale early on. A number of these have been kind of formalized, structured to incorporate both formal training, but also kind of social learning, farmer-to-farmer group learning. But I think intentionally or accidentally, a lot of these processes, participatory face-to-face communication processes, have helped farmers to integrate analytical and experiential cognitive processes. So experiential learning is if you experience something over and over again and you can relate it to past decisions, past impacts, it kind of burns into your memory and into your emotion, and that's a strong motivator to act on it. There are some biases that happen when you try to process information just from repeated experience, but that's what happens with weather. You experience weather forecasts pretty frequently, and you can kind of build that into your intuition pretty easily. Climate information, and I'm thinking particularly of climate forecast, but also historical climate information, is a statistical abstraction, and it's pretty challenging even for trained statisticians to make good decisions, to process it without bias and incorporate it into their decision making. It's possible, but there are actually some benefits if you can take this statistical abstraction through vicarious experience, through games, through discussions that help you to connect this new statistical information to your own memory or your collective experience or farmers' stories. It makes it more concrete, and it also helps reduce some of the biases, and it also motivates farmers to act on it. And as I mentioned, some of these have been kind of formalized as structured communication processes. A number just one-off for projects. A few are having traction in Africa. There are a few in Southeast Asia that are also having some traction in terms of adoption and upscaling. There's a temptation, 10 minutes remaining. There's a temptation to start work at a pilot scale on climate services for farmers with group participatory processes and then graduate to mass media because it's easier, it has better reach. I would argue that these different communication channels are complements, they're not substitutes. Mass media is not a substitute for group processes, but it can complement it. I filled this in just based on intuition or speculation, but I think this is an area, a learning agenda item, that needs some more systematic work to understand what communication channels are most suited to what functions that need to be a part of climate services communication. But group processes are effective, at least, especially in the initial learning time, and I don't think any of the other channels are as effective for understanding climate information historically and seasonal forecasts and the planning that needs to happen around it. The fact that there are a few structured processes, protocols that have some documentation makes it possible to mainstream them into agriculture extension or other intermediary organizations who work routinely with farmers on other types of information or other services. In Rwanda, I think we've gone farther there in scaling up structured, fairly intensive participatory processes than in other countries. The PICSA process, Participatory Integrated Climate Services for Agriculture, developed by University of Reading, is kind of the foundation for that. It's been introduced to agricultural extension personnel, professionals, and farmer volunteers who are part of Rwanda's Tujiri Muhenzi Agricultural Extension Program. So in a project there, we trained 3/4 of the way through the project. We've trained 1,600 extensionists and other intermediaries who have trained and facilitated 106,000 farm households in a structured, almost week-long training and planning process. And that's been done through a trainer of trainers, but then we actually had, we graduated from training trainers to engaging several faith-based NGOs who are just known to do really good community work, who've been taking over the scaling, and that's how we've been able to achieve scale. Radio, especially in Africa, in rural Africa, radio still plays a huge role. Mobile phones play an increasing role. There are some innovations to make radio more interactive and therefore responsive to local needs. The earliest one perhaps is listening groups, organized listening groups, but also connecting you listeners to programs through mobile phones. And there are actually several interesting, innovative models to do that. And in Rwanda, we're just starting to do, we've been working with community radio on climate services information programming to build awareness and to reinforce some of the concepts in the face-to-face communication. And 2 weeks ago, I was there for some an initial round of training of many of these agriculture extension personnel who have already been trained in the PICSA process to who are now being trained and facilitated to organize community listening groups who will take turns having the right to call in and participate in live debates and discussions online on the programming. On the demand side of climate services and the community that works there, there are still some things. There's been a lot of innovation, but these structured communication processes that I told you about, through a couple of workshops that tried to bring as many of those groups together as we could, through personal contacts, through the literature, I'm pretty certain that with only one exception, none of them have had any cross-learning. Every single one of them started from scratch, designed its own process. There's been no co-learning, which means that a lot of the innovations in some could fill some of the gaps in others, but this is not happening. And a lot of these processes are tailored towards the dysfunctional conventions of the information that's routinely available. So what we have is, instead of tailoring climate services to farmer needs, we're tailoring farmer communication and decision-making processes to National Met Service conventions. So those of us working on the demand side, we have some things that are broken that we need to fix. An increasing focus of work, maybe the majority of literature on climate services, is looking at co-production, the idea of bringing the supply side and demand side together to co-design, co-implement products and services that are more responsive to user needs. It's a great idea. Sometimes it works. It's not too hard to make it to work at a pilot scale if the National Meteorological Service comes actually intending and ready to change the way they do business. That just doesn't always happen. So there's almost always improvements in the communication processes. There may not be co-production of the actual information products. As we go to a larger scale, though, we have to think of institutions and processes that can capture farmers' voice, represent it in a legitimate way, aggregate it, figure out what's kind of the right level of aggregation, prioritize feedback, and it seems to make sense to do this incrementally. So I think there's an opportunity here that needs more work, but I think intuitively there are some things that could be made to work institutionally to get those feedback loops brought into incremental improvements in the design of services. And the Global Framework for Climate Services and the capacity building they're doing with individual countries to develop national climate service frameworks and institutional structures and policies. There's a window of opportunity for them, I think, to at least get countries to put these feedback loops on the radar and be thinking not of climate services as something that the Met Service provides to the other sectors, but to make sure that there's feedback and co-design in the other direction, and in a way that's structured, formalized, accountable. So co-production could solve the problems that I was talking about before, but the problems that I was talking about before are actually blockages to co-production really working. You have to have institutions that are able to represent farmers' needs. Farmers have to know what their own needs are, and that's kind of a challenge. How do you articulate demand for a product that you don't even know could exist? And even some of the institutions that, well-organized, advanced institutions that do really good work with farmers at the community level, they just kind of take it for granted. Whatever the Met Service provides, that's it. That's the limitation of climate science. So they end up reinforcing rather than effectively representing farmers' demands to the climate information providers. And then the National Meteorological Services, for reasons that I mentioned, plus just a very conservative institutional culture, it's not always responsive to farmer needs. So there are some impediments. I mentioned what some of them are. There have been some successes. There's been a lot of really good success and efforts to bring the supply side and demand side together in co-production, in improving the improving dialogue, improving awareness. There's even new journals that bring the two sides together much more. You see a lot of downstream innovation, pockets of downstream innovation on the communication, even some new kind of derived products, specialty products for the health sector, for the agricultural sector coming out of this dialogue. But actually very little upstream impact on what the Met Services provide themselves. Climate services are still very constrained by just dysfunctional products and lack of accessibility of historical data. And so despite huge advances in co-production and dialogue, the usability gap has not, at a continental scale, it really hasn't narrowed in the past 2 decades of really concerted, focused work, but with some bright spots, with some good exceptions. And this brings us back to a sort of a hypothesis that I think is well supported now, market atrophy problem that a continent-wide analysis brought up 12 years ago. And that's that key weaknesses on the demand side and on the supply side of climate services reinforce each other, holding both back. Information that's not very usable prevents users from developing the capacity to use, but also to understand and articulate demand for more useful information. Weak capacity on the part of users to even understand what's possible or understand their own needs because they don't have the experience with useful information makes it hard for them to really articulate demand. And I'm convinced from a lot of practical experience that this is true, that if you demand-driven climate services do not work. Supply-driven climate services do not work. Co-production is a wonderful idea, but it has some bottlenecks that are keeping it from working. If you want to actually make climate services work for farmers, build their adaptive capacity, build their resilience, you have to invest in, you have to address multiple bottlenecks, and usually that means bottlenecks on the information provision side and a range of bottlenecks on the demand side, farmers, the various organizations, national and international, that work with them and bring them both up, build their capacity together. And this is one of the things that I love about working in Rwanda. With generous USAID funding, we've been able to kind of bring both sides together in a way that I think is actually working really well. It's not the only place that it's working, but it's one that I'm closest to. So this suggests a few things that I think at a continental scale can be done. These things are feasible. They're not necessarily trivial, but they're feasible things that can be done to lessen the big logjam and open the door for the more contextual refinements, improvements, adoption of good practice, implementing kind of co-production. So on the supply side, if the regional climate centers, the regional climate outlook forums would introduce and evaluate new types of seasonal forecasts of the type that I've talked about before, but package them with local historical information and kind of create a demand and get rid of the separation between forecasts and the climatology that you're forecasting. This can be done. We see a few countries struggling to do it, and we see ICPAC, and well, Agromet is trying. ICPAC is ready to, but they're actually trying really hard to introduce it into the regional climate outlook form, but with some pushback from some national meteorological directors. So this is starting to happen, but it's a struggle. I really think there's a compelling argument if you're trying to benefit farmers, mainstream these data merging processes at the country level and get countries to start using high-resolution gridded data as a foundation for climate information products, and get them to shift policy from treating meteorological data as a source of National Met Service revenue to a public good. And this is probably the one recommendation that is not primarily technical, but maybe some technical work on cost-benefit analysis could help. If you could go to your Minister of Finance and say that for every dollar that I raise as a Met Service selling data, you're forfeiting $50 or however many dollars. I suspect it'll be 1 or 2 orders of magnitude more of contribution to the country's development as a result of lost opportunity. The opportunity cost of making money from selling data has to be huge, but it's not been quantified yet. On the demand side, where I come from, there's a real need to, I think, to get these different groups who are working together on innovative communication processes to sit down together, compare notes, bring in some good behavioral science and communication expertise and refine them, but also kind of redesign them so that they're ahead of the ball, adapt them so that they are communicating what the Met Services should provide, communicating what we know farmers need, because right now they're just kind of reinforcing and making it comfortable for the Met Services to do business as usual and keep the status quo. So if they would get a step ahead and design communication processes that would meet farmers' needs but that require new information, that might be a catalyst towards the Met Services providing that information. And then there are really two climate services communities. There's the climate community, the climate research, meteorological community with WMO, with ANCOMET on the political side in Africa. A lot of processes to bring them together, to strengthen them. They're very cohesive. On the demand side, the many organizations from the social sciences, from agriculture, from the other climate-sensitive sectors that are trying to develop climate services representing the demand side, we've got to get our act together. We don't have any professional organization. Our meetings are kind of ad hoc. We don't have standards. We don't have, we need to coordinate action. We need to share knowledge. We need to develop quality standards, mobilize resources, influence the supply side of climate services, what any professional community ought to do and should be evolving towards. So if that can be done, I think that'll be a huge help. And then on co-production, I think that, as I mentioned, I think the WMO's Global Framework for Climate Services is in a position to help kind of push this co-production process to be formalized as countries develop national climate services frameworks. And then finally, this is a learning agenda, so it's about identifying key knowledge gaps that are holding back progress and that if they are addressed can help advance implementation. So the things that seem to emerge from this synthesis are these questions. How can farmers evolving climate information needs be best identified, aggregated, prioritized to inform this sort of incremental co-production process at a national scale? There are both methodological and institutional questions here that have to be brought together. What's the added value of improved climate services practice? All these things that I identified as good practice. As I mentioned at the beginning, there's not a lot of evidence of if poor practice gives mediocre results, how much added value is there of good practice? We just don't have a really strong evidence base yet, so we need to accelerate that. What are the costs and benefits of shifting data policy? I mentioned that as if we have some good, credible analyses of that, it might help at least start the discussion between National Met Services and Ministries of Finance to help them to start treating observational data as a public good and a resource for development. How can communication channels best be combined to support climate services at a national scale? And then what's the reach, the effectiveness? As we go beyond these formal communication processes, we've learned that maybe there's at least a 10-to-1 kind of multiplier effect in the face-to-face communication processes, but we don't know how deep, how effective, what the reach, what the impact of that informal farmer-to-farmer communication is. So that's it. I promise to prepare probably twice the information that I would have time to prepare, but I hope there's some ideas here that are sparking some, that will spark further discussion, maybe some controversy. That was kind of my goal. So, Julia? Thank you.
Start on off. So for folks who are asking questions, please speak into the mic. It will be live, and just please say your name and where you're from, but do use the mic so we can pick it up on the webinar, please.
My name is Neil Boyer, and I'm at Peace Corps. And the question that I have is twofold. For one, you mentioned that most of the data is on farmers, but there's not a lot of data on pastoralists, uptake of using climate services. And when we look at much of the Sahel, we have increasing conflict between farmers and pastoralists, especially looking for pasture land and water, etc. What's your take on, you mentioned the Ministry of Finance and the whole idea of, public good, bringing in other actors, Ministry of the Interior, Ministry of Defense, so they look at it from a security perspective, vis-a-vis not just as a public good, but, the fragility of the state. If you look at, for example, the Middle Belt in Nigeria and places like, Uganda and Kenya, about using that as a mechanism to push for this greater integration. So taking it out of just the idea of public good for financial sake, but from a national security perspective as well.
When you say integration, can I just ask you to clarify what you mean?
Well, I mean, at the moment, you mentioned that, there's a supply and the demand constraint. On one hand, there's a better sense to provide this information as a public good because of, the resources which are foregone. However, if you look at it from a national security perspective, how can we provide this information to pastoralists and to farmers on a timely basis so we can reduce the conflict of pastoralists going into farmers' lands and creating that kind of struggle, which then takes on an ethnic and a religious overtone as well?
Yeah, I don't know that I have an answer to that. That's a tough challenge. And do we know that better information would reduce the conflict, or I mean, are we confident that better information will not increase those conflicts? I hope it will. Although I'm never a proponent of withholding information to try to increase equitability. I think the more transparent information is, the better the chances are of being able to negotiate solutions with all the cards on the table. And I know that what seems to be coming up is when studies that have looked at pastoralists, a lot of the climate information that's routinely available just doesn't really fit well their decision processes. But there may be other information, other ways of monitoring vegetation conditions, pasture forage conditions, and things like that that might be more relevant than what is routinely available and what's been evaluated. But it's also important to realize that not everyone's able to act equally on climate information. It may or may not fit the decision problem. You're bringing up some really, really interesting questions that I'd love to see more work on. Thank you.
I won't press anything. I'm Amelia. I work for CARE. And something that I think that I've read up recently, and I just kind of want your comment on, I guess I have two questions. One is just around using agroecology and food sovereignty as an alternative paradigm to climate-smart agriculture. And so meaningfully kind of doing a bottom-up approach in terms of, even in your presentation, and maybe I was just misreading things or interpreting them from the lens that I'm already looking at stuff, it's integrating feedback but not honoring local knowledge. And I think that that kind of came out in the co-production, but that's something, because there are very climate resilient practices that people do and have done for a long time. And so I think that honoring local knowledge is something that I think is really important and gets missed out a lot in some of these conversations. I'm not saying that this conversation particularly. And then the second question would be around computer literacy, because I think that there's obviously an effort to make the data more available and more open access. But if you're not meaningfully training people on how to use, machinery and technology that will allow them to access that data, that also is a problem. And so those are just two things that I'd love your thoughts on.
Okay. Well, the second one is easier to address. And again, I can speak from the Rwanda perspective. They're investing a lot in a local government down to, I guess, would be, well, the smallest administrative unit is quite small, the sector level, where I think 70% of the offices have internet connectivity and some computer hardware. And it's not the farmers who get who would go on the internet, but the internet becomes a portal for agricultural extension and the local government to provide the graphical information products that through printouts or projectors would be brought then in a well-structured process to the farmer. So it's not about farmers going on the website and getting this information, but about making it very accessible without having to go through a lot of, jump through a lot of hoops with a resource-constrained Met Service for agricultural extension and other intermediaries to have local actionable information packaged in ways that they've been trained already to present it to farmers. This one, so on the other one, there's a recent review paper that looked at co-production in the climate literature and attempted a typology that I struggled to understand it, but it did, I think, a service in the sense that it said that there are actually different disciplines that are looking at co-production in the context of climate with different goals, different objectives, and empowering indigenous knowledge is one, and improving services is another, and they may or may not be compatible goals. I'm all about trusting and empowering farmers' knowledge about their own management, their livelihood decisions. I think the jury's still out on what the role of indigenous climate knowledge is relative to what the Met Services produce. I think there's a lot of interesting work, and there's a lot of work that's just never tested, and I think when you come in from the standpoint of trying to empower indigenous knowledge, I empathize. I do come from a different perspective, and I've seen many, many cases, including CARES literature, where indigenous knowledge, there's an attempt to merge indigenous climate knowledge with what the Met Service provides on the argument that the Met Service information is not locally relevant, actionable, it's not, not specific enough, it doesn't really tell you enough about the local climate. You're allowing the Met Service to get off the hook and perpetuate poor practice. I mean, that particular function of indigenous knowledge is just allowing the Met Service to get away with not doing what they should be doing. And if they did what they were doing, it wouldn't be harmful. It would be helpful if the Met Service provided very local, actionable information that can be interpreted in terms of the local climate and its impacts. And all the rest of it, that's a really interesting discussion that I don't know. That could lead in a lot of different directions. But thank you for that.
Yes, so we're going to take a question from one of our online participants.
This question is from Deanna Gillespie, and it is, how have you seen farmers using climate information in relation to other forms of information, for example, price information or immediate household needs?
Well, all of that information, including indigenous knowledge, goes into their routine decisions. And I think there's actually a lot of value in trying to integrate different types of information. And I know some of the mobile phone companies and platforms are integrating market information with weather information, and I think there's a lot of value of doing so. One of the arguments, not just that the Agricultural Extension Service has the mandate and capacity that the National Met Service doesn't have to provide information to farmers, but if the agricultural research and extension system within a country, if it's functional, takes on that role, they'll understand better how it can be integrated with the other types of information that they already provide. Hopefully, that other information is relevant. I mean, if we can look in the literature to see what specific types of decisions are informed by what particular types of information products, and I'm sure that's also done with some of the other forms of information that you looked at. But I mean, what I think you're hinting at about the value of integrating information, I think I agree fully with that. And that's one of the things that the Met Service, and when they're trying to drive the whole process, doesn't really have the capacity to do, but the agricultural institutions, when they're strong, can do that better.
I really appreciate the
self-reflective honesty of your presentation, so thank you for that. It's quite useful. Listening to your talk, one of the things I kept trying to see was how do we capitalize on this experience in the agricultural sector and try to accelerate that learning experience into the application of climate information services in other sectors, and there are clearly some heuristics, methods, approaches that can be applied. But I was struck by the learning agenda question, I think it was number 3 on your final slide, which essentially said, what is the evidence base for improved livelihoods as a result of the use of information? I guess it's number 2, yeah. And I guess I'm interested in hearing from you about the sort of potential sustainability of this body of research moving forward once the donors sort of pull their funding, because one of the challenges that we have in the health sector is it is that the answer to that specific question, which is the bottleneck to the acceptance of climate information as one of the multiple lines of evidence for improving decisions, and there are obviously a lot of ethical implications to that. But it seems that the agricultural sector has moved forward for the better part of 20 years without that evidence base, and we're sort of stuck at that level. So I'd be keen to hear more from you on that.
Yeah, I think we are moving forward, dare I say, with USAID in the room, that sometimes we can bluff and provide a convincing qualitative case enough that they will entrust us to do some investment that seems to play out. But yeah, this lag in the evidence is a serious problem, and it's not keeping us from moving forward, but it's really slowing the pace of investment. I think as major development donors are getting on board, as climate finance is coming into the picture, and as the urgency of climate adaptation is being highlighted by several big, kind of shocking things happening just this year, we've got to do better on the evidence, and we have to do it really fast. But yeah, agriculture has, I think, the benefit of having more systematic use of other types of weather information and tools that use it for 30 or 40 years before, at least a couple of decades before seasonal climate forecasts became one new input to that. And I understand that the health sector, climate and health is a pretty new field, so you're trying to deal with a strong evidence base when you don't even have the history of work. I empathize with you, and I'm hoping, not all the research is donor funded, because academic institutions and health institutions are in a position with other resources to make some progress here. I'm more concerned about what happens with an implementation project when donor funds run out. And I would say, you can hold me accountable if in Rwanda the meteorological service isn't providing a much higher level of services than at the start of the project. If it's not being communicated and used, if it's not accessible, if there's not kind of a critical mass that still remains there, then I will acknowledge myself to have failed seriously. I'm really concerned about that uptake, and so we've been thinking a lot about capacity development from the onset, which is good, but we're kind of missing a policy buy-in and investment piece that we have 14 months to get in place now in that particular context. So these sustainability issues are huge, and it would be really helpful if donors could find a way to not pull the rug out from under things when we're close but not right there on the sustainability.
Okay, we're going to go to 2 online questions, and then we'll come back to the room.
So this next question is from Stephen Doyle, and he's asking, what is your opinion on collaboration with the ag industry to disseminate best practices?
I'm really curious what the best practices are in that case. So it is clear that in some contexts in Africa, a lot of the opportunity to escape poverty, to build resilience, is coming as the private sector value chain actors are getting more active and opening up more opportunities for farmers. When it comes to, if there's a private industry in climate service provision, that's a really complicated and challenging thing, and I know there's a huge amount of controversy, and I hope, Julie and I was just talking about that before we started, there's some issues that get discussed in small rooms in small communities that would be really good to completely put on the table and debate. Sadly, my first couple of experiences with private companies trying to provide climate services directly to farmers in Africa have, in one case, definitely undermined, and in the other case, had the potential to undermine the National Meteorological Service itself. So we have to think about that. There are some things that private companies can innovate on, and I'd say IT platforms, packaging information, there's a lot that they can do. There's probably a real role in the more commercialized agricultural sector, the more downstream aspects of climate services. I am very worried about, what's that? Yeah, I worry when private companies try to compete with meteorological services in providing observational data, because I know that the quality, theoretically the best quality that they can produce will be inferior to what the National Meteorological Service can produce and what at least 11 countries have produced, but that still needs to be empirically evaluated. But these discussions are not based on empirical evidence. They're based on a compelling story from a private company, often to a donor who's not a specialist in climate. There is a big move with the Global Weather Enterprise, led or at least facilitated by World Bank, and I want to understand the direction that that's going a bit better. I worry about it, and I hope that that dialogue becomes more transparent and more evidence-based, if that was what the intent of the question was.
And the second question is from Paul, and he's asking, is there room for greater experimentation and creativity in data illustration?
Data illustration, visualization, yeah. Yes, absolutely, desperately. And this is probably one of the things that the private sector does better than either the public research sector, including my own institution, which has some tools that are being taken up in a very productive way with the National Meteorological Services, and then the Met Services themselves, of course, have a lot of trouble. I'd really like to see African IT people take more of a lead on this than the Americans or Europeans.
Hi, thanks so much for your presentation. I'm Lori Ashley. I'm independent. It seems like most of the discussion has focused on how can farmers put to use information on seasonal or intra-seasonal timescales in terms of timing, that sort of thing. And at the beginning, you provided that really nice graphic about looking ahead as well. But when you think about climate information that's coming more on decadal or further into the future timescales, have you seen that being put to use, or do you have thoughts on how that can be put to use that best targeted towards farmers or more of the government or other institutional actors in the agricultural sector?
Well, that's a really good question. It should be a glaring gap in my presentation that I'm not really thinking. I'm not doing much work or talking much about the climate change timescales, but more the climate variability timescale. When we think of crop-based, smallholder farmers doing annual cropping, a lot of their livelihood decisions are at a, with the planning horizon a season ahead. So there's a lot of use, I feel like there's low-hanging fruit that the network that I'm involved in is in a good position to help there. But there's, if you're dealing with, if you're thinking about succession, what are your kids going to do? How are you going to divide up your land? Are you going to try to divide it between your kids or sell it? Or if you're growing perennial crops that have maybe an 8 to 15 year planning horizon, There are a number of other decisions at the farm level that are important. But if you're a value chain actor, if you're, in general, the higher the level you work, the more long-term, long planning horizon decisions you'll be making, and then the more relevant long-term, long lead information will be. That is hugely important. That's just, I'm not in the best position to make progress on that, but it should not be neglected either.
Okay, I think we have time for one final question if there is one. Otherwise, oh, Julia.
So a number of these questions have, in your responses, the recognition that climate information is one type of information that farmers are looking at. And then you also earlier in your talk spoke about the economic benefits of climate information and what the literature review is saying about that. I'm curious to what degree the literature is looking at climate information independent of all other types of information versus whether it is accounting for it as a part of a package of information and what that package could look like and the value of a basket of information rather than looking at individual types of information as a one-off cost-benefit ratio.
No, that's good. This passing reference to the need to integrate climate information with other types of information and climate services with other development interventions, it is huge. And actually, one of several evaluation challenges is that climate services have no intrinsic value. Their value comes from making other things work better. So climate information can help other development interventions work better. Other development interventions can enable you to act on climate information to manage risk. And you know, if you're towards the end of the season, you're probably more interested in the markets and market information. And it's not, markets are not completely independent of weather and climate, especially in where you have thin markets, thin local markets. So there's widespread recognition of the need to integrate climate services with other information and other development interventions, but almost no systematic work on evaluating or figuring out either how to do that or how that might impact the value. Maybe it goes there. Yes.
Okay, well, that brings us to our time. So I want to, again, thank both Jim and Julia for coming and presenting here today. I think you've given us a lot of really rich information that demonstrates both how far I think climate services have come in terms of being able to be more localized and utilized on the ground, but still how far there is to go in both the learning agenda and the practical application thereof. So I really want to thank you for taking the time and coming and sharing this knowledge with us. And thank all of you for both in person and online for participating. Again, there will not be an adaptation community meeting in December, but please look out for our next meeting, which will be in January on the 17th, looking at fragility and climate risk. And if you haven't signed up for our notifications through